The fact that there are two temples, or to be more precise, more correct, two different Greek words in the New Testament for temple, has served as an unceasing thorn for a lot of lay Christians in their attempt to make any sense of the gospel accounts. We think we know something about the temple according to as much information as we're given in the Old Testament. One of those things we're told is that the temple is off limits for the layperson. Moreover, we're told that the Holy of Holies is off limits for anyone but the high priest, and that once a year. And we're even informed that over in Hebrews chapter 9. Therefore, we run into a problem in the KJV whenever we get into Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, the historical New Testament books, because we see people, including lay people, continually going in and coming out of the temple. The early Christians met in the temple. Well, they didn't really meet in the temple. Our problem there goes back to the fact that we've got two different Greek words, both of which can be and are in the KJV translated temple. And although I said some things about this before, I think it's so crucial that I want to go on record tonight a little more thoroughly. The English word temple occurs in the KJV, let's round it off, about 120 times in the New Testament, with the plural occurring only twice, both in the book of Acts. Once in chapter 7, where Stephen, before the Sanhedrin, in quoting Isaiah, said, "Howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples," plural, "made with men's hands." That's verse 48. And then again in chapter 17, 10 chapters later, Acts 17 and verse 24, where Paul, preaching at Athens, makes reference to the fact, well, he says essentially the same thing Stephen does in his apology or defense in Acts 7:48, that God, the Lord of heaven, the one who has made all things, does not need to, and he does not, dwell in temples made with men's hands. So there are a couple of plural occasions that really aren't of any concern for us now. In every one of these other approximately 120 times where temple occurs in the KJV NT, one of two Greek words may be seen as the source for that translation, with the exception of Luke 11:51. We'll have to be a little technical tonight, at least to begin with, to get through some of these Greek terms here. In Luke 11 and verse 51, the KJV has temple, that Zechariah, son of Berechiah, was slain between the altar and the temple. Between the altar and the temple. The same account is given over in the end of Matthew 23. However, the Greek doesn't have either of the two words we're going to spend half of our time at least tonight discussing. It doesn't have either of those two words. It has the simple Greek term oikos, which means house. House. Jesus often spoke of my Father's house, and to be sure he was making reference to the temple, but he didn't use either of the temple words. He used a common term, oikos, which is translated house. So for some strange reason, and I don't know exactly why, this is the only place in the KJV where the men translated oikos, house, as temple, Luke 11:51. It does mean the temple, but he did not use that term. And in other places in the Gospels where Jesus speaks of my Father's house, such as in Matthew chapter 22, you have made my Father's house a den of thieves, they give us house and not temple. So you may want to make a note of that, and although you don't have a problem with the occurrence in the English of the word temple in Luke 11:51, you may want to scratch it in your Bible and put house, since that's the term, and he perhaps meant something differently by selecting the term house rather than temple. That's, of course, not our purpose tonight. So let's go on. What are those two words then? Well, I'll write them in Greek up here for you in the first place. We'll discuss them one at a time. Then I'll write them in English. And you've studied Hebrew, and you know that Hebrew and English are not at all similar. Greek and English are very similar. If you can write English, you can write Greek. The Greek, for the first term we're going to discuss, is hieron, which in English translates, well, you can tell you got an I, an E, P's in Greek are R's, O, and V's in Greek are N's. And a backwards apostrophe, which we call a rough breathing, is an H. So you've got Hieron, H-I-E-R-O-N. This is a term of the two that appears most frequently. Slow me down if I go too fast. It's used 71 times in the KJV New Testament, and it is always translated temple. Hieron, H-I-E-R-O-N. You could just put about 70 times it appears in the KJV New Testament. And it is always translated temple. But if we mean by this, and I think we would all naturally think so, the actual temple building itself, we would be most mistaken. And many verses would make no sense to us at all. Now, I've mentioned this fact before on several occasions, just in passing and teaching in this church over the years. But as I say, I think it is so important, and especially where it fits with what we're studying right now, that I want to go on record a little more thoroughly tonight. And I hope that you'll get this down. You don't have to remember the Greek words, but that you'll get down the fact that there are two terms, they are differentiated, and if you don't know that, you're led into a lot of confusion in the historical books of the New Testament, Matthew through Acts. I'm tempted to give you all 71 places where it appears, so you can change all 71. I think I'd be justified in doing it, but I have so many things I always need to say that I better not take the time. You all have a concordance. You can find them on your own. I am going to take you through a few of them to show you what I'm talking about. Some of you understand, some of you may not understand. So if you'll open your Bible over to Matthew chapter 21, we'll begin. Now, it could be argued that, well, the context will dictate in what sense we should take the English term temple. Well, you'll be right maybe 90% of the time. There are a few occasions, however, where knowing the context will not help at all, and I'll point one of those out. If you didn't have parallel passage, you'd be lost without knowing what the Greek has to say. And it does and could and would make a difference. But since we know what the Old Testament says, we even know that from reading Hebrews, that the temple, T-E-M-P-L-E, maybe not Hieron, but the temple, as we know the temple, is off limits to the layperson. And, well, the holy place is off limits for even the Levites. No one but priests could go in there. And the Holy of Holies is off limits for everyone but the high priest on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And so we run into problems as we read the Gospels with people going in and out of the temple all the time, including Jesus. And so some people have thought, lay people in their naivete, well, Jesus was the Lord of the temple. That gave him the right to go in there. Well, he would have been teaching to the showbread then, because no one else would be in there, because it was off limits, unless he found a few priests in there, and they were not ones who really received his teaching. So Matthew 21, verses 12 to 15. Now, other translations just choose a whole lot of different ways to solve this problem. For instance, the NIV sometimes will translate it, I think they do here, I'm not for sure, I haven't checked the NIV, but like just with the word temple. You'll just leave it temple like the KJV has, which is not a lot of help. Sometimes temple area, sometimes temple courts. There's a whole variety of different ways of translating. And I don't know of any one good solution. Temple is not good. But if you don't say temple, you've got to say, well, like the general area that was adjacent to the temple. Well, you'll get writer's cramp filling that in 71 times in the New Testament. I mean, we'd like to find one nice little succinct statement that we could put in there. When you say that, you've said it all. But you really don't have that, not that I know of. You could put in other words like courts or area or precincts or something after the word temple, and you'd only be writing one word then, but you'd be dependent on what the KJV has given you as well. So the best thing to do is just write the Greek out everywhere and remember what's naos and what's hieron, but that'd probably be asking too much of you. Jesus went into the temple of God. I mean, when you first started reading the Bible, what was your conception? Maybe tonight, what is your conception? Or go back a few weeks before we started this subject. Your conception, Jesus went into the temple of God, I mean, I'll be honest, if you want, when I first started reading the Bible, I had a temple picture. You know, a temple. Maybe vaguely in the back of my mind, I knew the Old Testament said no one can go in there, but, I mean, this is the Bible. The Bible says that he went into the temple, so I had a proof text for that. Without knowing, well, maybe what's the Greek behind this? Jesus went into the temple of God and cast out all them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers, and the seats of them that sold doves. Kind of like church bazaars and charismatic conferences today, selling everything under the sun in the house of God, taking an emphasis off the word, which is where the emphasis should be. You know, if you've been in these big meetings, bumper stickers and the Dove license plates, and, well, you could buy just about everything. Probably get your hair done in a Holy Spirit fashion at some of the tables. I was at a place where you could buy Christian insurance. They just had the tables out there. This is one of the big faith people also, Christian insurance. Well, I don't know. That's a new one for me there. And he said unto them, it is written, my house were to the oikos term, should be called the house of prayer, but you've made it a den of thieves. The blind and the lame came to him in the temple. Well, now, people with any type of physical defect were certainly placed in the category of the people for which this area would be completely off limits. Any physical defect. And very specifically, Matthew tells us that the physically handicapped, the blind and the lame, those that were oppressed of Satan, came in the temple, and he healed them. And when the chief priests and scribes, we'll get to who those people are in a very extensive study in this class very soon, saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying in the temple, and saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, they were sore displeased. So there's one place, just among many, and we're just going to take the time to look at a few of these to set the scene, certainly not all 71. If you go over to Luke chapter 2, Luke chapter 2. This is the most frequent of the two terms. And it doesn't mean, as we would naturally take on first reading, the temple. It doesn't mean that. Nothing makes sense to us if it does. How you could have all these people, lay people, non-ordained people, non-Aaronic, non-priestly people, people with physical defects and handicaps, all found in the temple. Luke 2 and verse 27. This is the case of Simeon coming into the temple at the appropriate time. He came by the Spirit into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him after the custom of the law, then took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, and he begins to prophesy. Well, there you've got a woman now. A woman right after childbirth coming into the temple. Then if you skip down to, verse 36. There was one, Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phuel of the tribe of Asher. Anna the prophetess, this well-known figure in the infancy of Christ. She was of a great age, and Luke goes on to tell us what he means by great age. She had lived with an husband 7 years from her virginity. That means that, after she got married, then they were happily married for 7 years. And she was a widow of about 84 years. Her marriage lasted 7 years. Her husband died. She's been a widow for 84 years. Now, it's rare to find an 84-year-old person, period. We're talking about an 84-year-old widow. That is, she's been a widow for 84 years. That'd put her over 100 years of age. That's an interesting passage. Luke gives us that not just because he didn't have anything else to say or to fill up space, but to meditate on. You sit down and think about that. A woman who, for 84 years, that's as old as maybe a whole lot of 3 groups of people here in the church. 84 years, she's been a widow in the temple, serving God day and night with prayers and fastings, as we see. She was a widow of about 84 years, who departed not from the temple, but served God with fastings and prayers night and day. She had quite a commitment to the God of Israel. It's no wonder that God chose someone like her, as well as perhaps this man Simeon, to be the ones to see and to receive Messiah whenever he came. I mean, we complain, charismatics complain, when they've been believing for something for 2 years or 3 years, or looking for the rapture for 8 years or 18 years. She'd been there for 84 years. That's almost a century of time. And where was she all these 84 years? Well, Luke says, in the temple. Verse 46. It came to pass that after 3 days, they, Joseph and Mary, found him, Jesus, in the temple as a 12-year-old. This was the year before his bar mitzvah, sitting in the midst of the doctors, both hearing them and asking them questions. A 12-year-old in the temple. And then look over in John chapter 10, verse 23. Of course, a whole lot of these occurrences, we're skipping over a lot as we're going through the New Testament, are simply parallels of something else found. I'm looking at some of the ones that are not parallels, like in Luke and here in John, that are a little more interesting because of the fact they say more. The one in Matthew would be a parallel, Jesus in the temple. Well, he was in the temple on several occasions. Mark 11, John 2, having there, casting out the money changers and so forth. And Jesus walked, we're in verse 23 of John 10, Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. Now, we've got something combined on our hands there. He's in the temple in Solomon's porch. Well, how do you have a porch in the temple? Porches are on the outside of the building, not the inside. That should serve to cause us to hesitate and ask ourselves a question about that passage. And then what about the experience of the early church? In Acts 2 and verse 46, they continuing daily, these are Christians now. Christian Jews to be sure, but Christians. With one accord in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, did eat their meat with gladness and singleness of heart. Every one of these occasions is here on. Chapter 5 and verse 21. The apostles are locked up for preaching the resurrection. The angel of the Lord opens the prison, and very early the next morning, Acts 5:21, they entered into the temple. Now those are some very specific words. They didn't go to the temple, or they were around the temple. They entered into, you've got two entrance words there. They entered into the temple. And then the only place, and you may want to make note of this, found outside of the historical books, that's Matthew through Acts, is 1 Corinthians 9:13. Okay, so let me say it another way. Every time you come across the word temple, from Romans to Revelation, we're talking about the second of the two Greek terms. We haven't gotten to that one yet. We're talking about the second of these two Greek terms, with the exception of 1 Corinthians 9:13. That helps in one regard. In other words, the second word is the word that predominates in the epistles. The first word is the one that predominates in the Gospels and Acts. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9:13, "Do you not know that they which minister about holy things live of the things of the temple? And they which wait at the altar are partakers with the altar." So he, as you'll see, if you don't understand everything yet, as you'll see before we're through tonight, he would have to use the term we're on for temple now, in view of the fact of the subject that's under discussion here. And secondly, in view of the fact that he goes on to make reference to the altar. Well, to be sure, there were two altars, one inside the temple, capital T, and one outside, one of incense and one of sacrifice or burnt offering. And it's obvious which one he has reference to here. So, what this word means, hieron, H-I-E-R-O-N, is the temple compound. You often see it described like that. The temple courts, you often see it described like that, or the temple precincts. Those are the three ways you generally see it translated in a technical, specific way. The temple compound, the temple courts, or the temple precincts. Now you're going to have to stay up with this as we go along, because we're going to be talking about a whole lot of different parts that are related to the temple. Our second part of our study tonight, assuming we've got time, is to look at the Temple Mount, M-O-U-N-T, which is something else entirely. So we have to keep all of these words clearly distinguished in our mind so we're not confused. In other words, what I mean by the temple precincts, the area or the courts that surround the actual temple per se, or to use a term that the NIV and other translations will sometimes use, the sanctuary. The sanctuary as a translation for the second Greek term we'll be looking at. Now, whenever, like in first year Greek, I remember, whenever you're in first year Greek, since I've been in it in several places, I've been in it several different times, this is one of your early words, is hieron. And, whenever you're doing vocabulary in English or something, you'll have a word and then you'll have the definition. Or if it's a foreign language, then you'll have the foreign word and you'll have the corresponding English word. And, without exception, what you have in first year Greek, at least my experience has been this, is you've got hieron, Greek, equals temple. Well, that's very, very misleading to a first year Greek student. To tell him that, and your early words are the words that stay with you the longest, because they're the words you have more time to go over and rehearse, and you just got that pounded into you, hieron, 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 is temple, temple, temple. That's very, very misleading if it's not explained, because what we think of as temple is, Solomon's temple, Herod's temple, a church building, a sanctuary, that type of thing. One main official building per se, called the temple. And that is as far from the truth as it possibly could be. It has nothing to do with the temple except the area that surrounds the temple. It doesn't say anything about the temple itself, except by virtue of extension, that you couldn't have temple precincts, temple compound, temple courts without a temple. But that's our second word we're going to get to. Only by extension does it have anything to say with regard to the temple building, singular, itself. There were hundreds of temple buildings, plural. There was only one temple building, singular. All right, are you following me so far tonight? And you more or less sort of knew this because I've said it before. All right, let's go on to our second term here, which is naos. N-A-O-S. It's used 46 times. And it is always used for the actual sanctuary itself. You see, in other words, here's what I'm saying. The Greek has a way of distinguishing between the two. Well, we do too in English. If we're going to add more words, we can call this temple and these temple courts. But the Greek has an actual way of distinguishing between the two. One meaning the sanctuary, and that's the last term, and it's not used as often as the first. Sanctuary is not referred to as often as the area that surrounds the sanctuary. And then another term that would apply to that. And this is the term, as I say, that you find most of the time in the epistles and in Revelation. As a matter of fact, you don't find it very often in the Gospels. I don't think, I would have to double check, I don't think it's found ever in the book of Acts. I think you find it a few times. By a few, I mean like, I don't know, under 15 to be sure. A few times in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I don't think it occurs a single time in the book of Acts. And yet we know that the disciples, the early Christian church, the apostles, are at the temple in Acts all the time. That means we're always talking about the first word then, never the second term, the actual sanctuary itself. Now, with that in mind, let's look at a few passages, and I'll go from Gospels to Revelation, where this is the word behind our KJV term temple. For instance, in Matthew 23, verses 16 through 21, here are a few of the times in the Gospels where naos actually appears, and it is the sanctuary. Woe unto you, ye blind guides, which say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing, but whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. See, we were just a couple of chapters earlier in chapter 21 in looking at hieron. And we've got temple both times. You would know otherwise, unless you could deduce some things. Ye fools and blind, for whether is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And he goes on talking about the altar, and then you've got temple again in verse 21. Whoso shall swear by the temple sweareth by it and by him that dwelleth therein. In Luke 1 in verse 9, now this is going to be totally unlike all the other cases you have in the Gospels where we read someone is going into the temple. It's always hieron, and it's never anyone going into the sanctuary. See, I might have told you that, and you leave with that and think that, well, that would be true across the board. Well, not quite. Luke 1 in verse 9. Zechariah the priest, according to the custom of the priest office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into. Again, you've got two entrance words. When he went into the temple of the Lord. That's naos there. He went into the sanctuary. He went into the building itself. All those times where the disciples went into the temple and Jesus went into the temple and the money changers were in the temple, not this word. It's our first term. The temple courts, precincts, compound. Here's an exception, though, of someone going into the temple. This man truly went into what is truly the temple. Also in verses 21 and 22 of this chapter, the people waited for Zechariah and marveled that he tarried so long in the temple. He was actually in the building. And when he came out, he could not speak unto them, and they perceived that he had seen a vision in the temple. And he beckoned unto them and remained speechless. In John 2, verses 19 to 21, you don't need to turn there. We read that last time, and I've already quoted it tonight. Destroy this temple. What temple what word do you think Jesus would use? He couldn't use the word that would speak of the temple precincts, because how can his body be the temple precincts? Destroy the temple compound here. John said this he spake, speaking of his body. Well, he has to use the naos term. John 2, 19 to 21. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. There's no way he could have reference. So sometimes the context, most of the time, 90% of the time, the context will let you know, are we talking about sanctuary or courts? It's always one or the other. The Jews said 46 years, was it in the building? Well, that included not only the temple, but the precincts, to be sure. 1 Corinthians 3. 1 Corinthians 3, verses 16 to 17. Know ye not that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit? Well, not temple precincts as though he could wander around out in the courts or be over here or over there. You'd have to be the word that's a sanctuary itself, because the body is like a building, like a sanctuary. Your yard would be like temple precincts or compound, not your body. That's why it's often found in the epistles, because you've got things that speak of something along this line. In Ephesians 2:21. And then the book of Revelation, from Revelation 3:12 through Revelation 21:22. The term naos appears for a total of 16 times just in the book of Revelation. In other words, the term naos appears more in the book of Revelation than in any other single book in the Bible. Let me give you one other passage in Mark 11, verses 15 and following, that is very interesting. And they come to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple, began to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers, and the seats of them that sold doves, and would not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. Now that's unique. Nowhere else is that. You don't have a parallel for that anywhere in the New Testament. That verse right there is unique. Mark 11:16. Should not suffer that any man should carry any vessel through the temple. Well, they couldn't go into the temple in the first place, so they wouldn't be carrying anything through it. But when you know that the term here is the hieron term, that he, as we could tell from verse 15, when he went into the temple, that what he's talking about here, all of the precincts and courts and buildings and the surrounding area around the temple, then what Mark tells us, that we're not told this elsewhere in the New Testament, is that the people in Jerusalem were using the temple precincts as a shortcut. Rather than go around, whenever they had to go somewhere real quickly, you know, if it was just some secular or maybe even some illegal errand they were on or duty they were about to perform, rather than walk around the temple precincts and compound, they'd run right through it. And not only does Jesus cast out money changers and those that sold oxen and doves, he's stopping something else that the other gospel writers don't tell us about. He's stopping anyone using it, trafficking back and forth through it, if they're not there for religious and spiritual reasons. Now, I mentioned that a long time ago whenever we did some tapes from John 2 about these religious hucksters that used the Church of God for everything under the sun, but what it was meant for, the worship. Worship like a couple of hours a week, and so you can't just let that building sit there, so you rent it out to JC's or anybody, you know, all week long. You just rent it out. And we got a warning against that right here. Not that God is into buildings today, to be sure, but I think the attitude behind it all in the denominational world is certainly unscriptural, and it's prohibited right here. If you're going to meet in a building like that, and you're going to call it the church building, which is not scriptural to begin with, but the church building with your stained glass windows and your steeple and so forth, then you better let it be for that and for that alone. What you're doing is you're calling it the temple of God. This is the temple. And Jesus wouldn't allow any man to carry any vessel through the temple. Not just the building, the whole courts, the whole area around that. And if your history is like my history, we did everything under the sun. The precincts of our church temple, everything from volleyball to sweetheart dances were held right on the church premises. I think that would come under the prohibition of Jesus in Mark 11 and verse 16. I think very definitely it would come under that prohibition. So anytime you're outside of the Gospels and Acts, the word that you'll find will be the sanctuary term, with the exception of 1 Corinthians 9:13. But that doesn't really help us, because the Gospels and Acts are where the difficulties exist, not in the epistles. So that's not a lot of help. So the best way to approach the temple is to, well, don't forget about the Greek terms, but do an actual study of it, which is what we're going to do. All right, so we're going to move into another gear tonight. We'll go beyond the actual words here, and we'll start a study of the temple, the area, what all comprised that region, so we'll better understand the Gospels, Acts, whenever we read them.
I had a question.
Yes.
Mark 11:15, what word do we put there? Or just leave it temple, or?
Well, it's up to you what you want to do with those 71 times that temple appears, but it's the hieron term. It's up to you what you want to do. I've left all mine the same because I think I know what the context is saying. In the few cases where it's difficult, then you just have to study it, memorize it then. But anytime you read Jesus going into the temple, you know he was a layman. He was not a priest. He was not a scribe. He was not a high priest. He had no right in the temple building. He would have been executed had he been called in there. And so he never went in the temple. So the word there would be the temple compound. the temple courts, the temple precincts. That's what Mark 7:15 or Mark 11:15 and 16 are saying. But if you change, those two, you've got 69 other places you'd have to change. But you'd find it interesting to look up all 71 occurrences. To look them up, you can find it in your concordance. Which ones fall under this number versus that number, and find which one is 71 times. And you'd find it interesting to look and see passages that you're very familiar with in Gospels and Acts, especially Gospels, since I said Acts, I think, uses only the hieron term. Well, just which ones use the sanctuary term and which ones use the court term. I think you'll probably find it interesting. Okay, no other questions? Let's go on then. What we're going to say about the temple is going to be rather brief. I think I've got about 4 other studies in addition to tonight. And that's because it's not the exclusive property of the intertestamental period, such as things like the diaspora work. I mean, where else can you study diaspora? You don't study that under Old Testament, or, where else would that fit? That is something that is characteristic of the period between Malachi and Matthew. Other things are not so exclusively the property of ITP. The temple is one of those things, not exclusively the property of ITP. You say, well, where else could it be studied? Well, it's studied in a variety of situations. Biblical geography and archaeology, I think, would be an appropriate place to study the temple. A study of the Gospels. You'd have to know something about the temples to study the Gospels. The life of Christ and so forth are perhaps easier places to justify an extended time spent on the Jerusalem temple. So I want to underscore the fact tonight that all I want to do is give you an introduction to the Jewish temple, but an accurate introduction. An introduction that just says a couple of things and breezes on is no introduction. It brings more confusion than it brings help. So all I intend for this to be for the next month or so is an introduction to the Jewish temple. And I want to primarily impress upon your mind 2 neglected highlights. We've seen them before already in our study. We'll see them tonight, and we shall see them again. And those aspects are the following. First of all, the immensity of hieron naos, both of them. The temple building itself is larger than you might realize, far larger than you might realize. The temple precinct, the temple courts, are very much larger than you might realize. And secondly, the diverse layout of hieron. Okay, so it's an introduction that will serve 2 functions here, to highlight 2 things that I think are neglected. The immensity, the immense size of the temple compound, the temple area, and the diverse layout of the temple as well as the temple area. As I said, both of these aspects have already come to play on what we've said thus far, and we shall see much more as we continue along. But I can't help but think back to my early days of Christianity and reading the Bible, and it would have been a lot of help to me. I had no idea what the temple looked like. Whenever I first got saved, I bought me a Halley's Bible handbook in a hurry so I could find something what was going on, and I didn't know whether I could trust Schick's drawing, which is the old, 1800 standard drawing of the temple, Schick's drawing. I didn't know whether I could trust that or not. I found out I really couldn't. But at least it told me more than I could think about or know on my own. And so there are different ways we're going to approach this, different aspects or areas. We're just going to do one tonight with the short time that I've got left. And that is the Temple Mount. Then we'll look at things later like the temple compound, precincts, area, the sanctuary, and so forth. The Temple Mount. I better just erase that. I need to draw. You knew how to spell mount anyway, didn't you? Maybe not temple, but at least mount. Well, what Herod has to do here is find a place that's large enough to put the temple. Well, you say there's already a temple there, Zerubbabel's. Well, to be sure there is. But remember, the poverty forced on the returning exiles necessitated the fact that the temple was very, very small. Small in comparison to Solomon's temple, small in comparison to what it's going to be, as we're going to see here under the time of Herod. And so you've only got X amount of area. I think the best way to do this, I've got lots of pictures and slides. I brought a few pictures along I might try to show you, but we'll just have to save some of this for another time. It's to show you kind of what the city of Jerusalem would look like. The city of Jerusalem is up on a plateau, 2,500 feet above sea level. Now that's half of Denver's height, right? Mile-high city, so it's half a mile high above sea level. The plateau that drops off on all areas, especially over on the eastern and southern areas. So if we remember our directions here, north, south, east, west, I'll go according to that, then watch what this will look like. And so forth. We're not too concerned about up north there. We're not too concerned about that. Okay. This little area right here is known in the Old Testament as Ophel. It's also called the city of David. You see, this is where you get into too much geography and archaeology, and it's not ITP. So I can only say so much. But this was called Ophel, O-P-H-E-L, or the city of David. Anytime you read the city of David, it's not what you read in the New Testament when you read Jerusalem. It's vastly expanded. It has grown so much by that time. And you've got Hezekiah's old tunnel, and you've got Gihon. You probably remember Gihon Spring, and Hezekiah had to dig the tunnel to get the water into the city in case they were under siege and so forth. You got Gihon Spring right over here. All right, let's take this back out for a moment. Then what you have, according to Genesis 22:2 and 2 Chronicles 3:1, is the so-called Old Testament Mount Moriah. And it's also called Zion in the Old Testament. I think it's only called Mount Moriah, though, on a couple of occasions. 2 Chronicles 3:1 and Genesis 22:2. Now, that is a prominent point, a hill that's, it's located up here in this area. And so whenever David, I'll have to draw his city back in here. Whenever David was occupying Ophel, then David's house would probably be somewhere up here. This goes uphill, by the way. This is sloping up. As we go up, it's sloping up this way and up this way. Remember, David was out on his roof one night and he saw Bathsheba, evidently nude, taking a bath somewhere nearby. Well, he had to be close enough he could see the woman. They didn't have, binoculars and things like that in those days. He had to be close enough to see the woman. He had to be high enough up. Well, her house is probably right down here, very close to one another, the king's palace and her house down here, so that he'd be above her looking down and he could see her when she was on her roof. Then David would do his sacrificing up here, and that's the actual area where Solomon was later to build the temple. There is a rock there, known as the Rock of Abraham, that measures something like 51 by 53 by 6 feet. It's still there today. As I've said, I've seen that rock and been in there and touched it. It is a holy rock to Jews, to Christians, and to Muslims. It is the rock on which Abraham came very close to sacrificing Isaac. It is the rock on which Solomon built his temple. It is allegedly the rock from which Allah's prophet Muhammad ascended into heaven. Of course, I don't believe that nonsense. But it is a rock that does exist, something like 50 by 50 by 6 feet. That's a huge rock. I mean, solid rock. That is a solid rock there. We're getting to Temple Mount. On the eastern side of the plateau upon which the city of Jerusalem will be built is the valley known as the Valley Kidron. On the southern side, over to the western side, is Hinnom Valley. Hinnom. These valleys are still clearly visible today. Clearly visible. This Hinnom Valley was the place where all rubbish and garbage from the city were taken and burned. Kidron is a valley through which a small wadi flows, and it is a valley which separates the city of Jerusalem, or the temple, from the Mount of Olives. Mount of Olives is over here, Gethsemane here, Bethany and Bethphage and so forth are on the other side of the Mount of Olives. Kidron is a very, very deep valley that separates the two. Whenever you tour Israel or Jerusalem, oftentimes the first place you're taken, and you're taken in the morning, it doesn't help to go here in the afternoon, is on a little parking level right here on the very top of the Mount of Olives. So with the sun to your back, you have a glorious view of Jerusalem early in the morning. It does no good to come there in the afternoon, though, because the sun is over here looking you right in the eyes, and you can't see anything. You're blinded by the sun. You say, well, what's this area right here? That is also a valley. It's the Tyropoeon Valley. I think that's the way you spell it. Tyropoeon. The Tyropoeon Valley. It no longer exists today because, you can only see remains of it because it has been filled in with so much debris. In the demolition of some of the buildings and the rebuilding, it has been filled in with debris, and it's only slightly visible. What it served in that day for, and this was true in Jesus' day though, was to separate what's called the upper city from the lower city. The lower city is where most of the common people live. Houses were very, very cramped together in Jesus' day. The upper city is where more of the elite people lived. And upper and lower meant elevation. This was higher up than this. The lower city is the so-called Ophel, or city of David. Okay, so getting back to the Temple Mount. What Herod has to do, he's got this area where the temple was located, the temple compound, the temple precincts. And it's a choice place. It's the highest spot in the city, Mount Zion. What he has to do, however, is enlarge the area to hold the type of temple with all of its renovations that he has in store. But because the area is too small as it exists, what he has to do is push rock back to fill up some of this southern area of Kidron so that this hill actually extends more over like this now and gives us more room for the temple here and more room for the temple there. It was a massive project. That was the first thing he had to do before you could build anything. You've got to get your fill in and get some firm foundation there. Now, here's what I want to give you tonight. I don't know if we'll get through all of this tonight. This area, which is known as the Temple Mount, and in which you're going to find the temple precincts here on would fit there. That area was 35 square acres. 35 acres. Now, the best thing I can think for you to do, because I just know most of you can't appreciate these figures we're going to be giving. I know that's true. That a whole lot of you can't appreciate these figures. And I want you to appreciate them, or you're going to fail to, really grasp what we're saying here. Whenever you turn off the highway on the road and come up here to the church, there's a pasture down there. What is that, like 15 acres there? That's 14 acres. You look at that on Sunday morning. If you remind yourself, your husband, your wife, look at that. When you come here, it'll be too dark tonight. Look at that on Sunday morning. That's 15 acres Double that size. You look at that, double that size, and add 5 more acres to it. What we're talking about, and you probably noticed it over the years as you've driven up here, but now with this in mind, look at that. I mean, I'd hate to be the one called to throw a baseball across that thing, or to hit a deer on the other side of it. That's a long way across that. 15 acres is a lot of area. That's not even half the size of the Temple Mount, which is where the temple would be found. Now, we're talking about people going in and out of the temple, and Jesus there and trying to escape and hiding, and people looking for him, and he withdrew himself, and they couldn't find him. They were taking up stones to kill him. Now you won't think of a little area 100 feet by 100 feet, where how could anyone hide in an area like that? We're talking about an immense area. It's more than double the size of that pasture down there. 35 acres. An acre's what, about 200 by 200 feet, 43,000 square feet. This is 300 plus by 500 plus, not feet, yards, which would be 900 plus by 1,500 plus feet. That's a long, long way. I know 900 feet doesn't sound like a lot to you. That's why I put it in yards. 300 yards, the length of 3 football fields. You ever played football and you had the ball, been a wide receiver on your own 1 and caught a pass on your 7, and you're responsible for running a touchdown? 93 yards? You're tired by the time you get to the end of that. People catch up with you by the time. I remember playing football. I got caught one time. That's a long way. I caught the ball way back at our goal line. And I'm responsible for running, you think 100 yards, it's nothing. You get about, 40 yards from the other goal line, that's a long way. We're not talking about 100 yards, 500 yards by 300 yards. Okay? I'm trying to impress on your mind again tonight the immensity. It was a very immense project that was involved here. So this is essentially what you end up with, 35 acres for the Temple Mount. Now, a whole lot of this was straight fill. I mean straight deep fill. This valley drops off like a precipice down here. It still does today. It's not like a little, 10-foot drop off. You got to add some fill in so you got enough of a foundation here. This is like 100 feet drop off. That's a lot of fill to bring in. Some of it was straight fill. Other was fill over huge underground vaults built with stone blocks in an arch fashion. One of these is still visible underground today, and it's known as Solomon's Stables. I think it's been misnamed. It wasn't Solomon's, and he never kept horses down there. But it's been named, I think misnamed, Solomon's Stables. I have pictures of this. It's underground. It's underneath the Temple Mount. The Dome of the Rock is what dominates this, and there are other Muslim edifices up here. Whenever you go down, you can underneath it. You got a whole city underneath the Temple Mount. Now, a lot of it has been filled in. We've lost a lot of it. A lot of it was straight fill to begin with. But some of the huge underground vaults, at least one that I know of, can still be seen today, and it's known as Solomon's Stables. The masonry of Solomon's Stables is that of the Herodian period, but the building is actually much later, up into the Crusades, the Turks and the Crusades period. So, of course, how you would explain that is, with the destruction in AD 70, a lot of that was destroyed, and people came later and took the blocks that were still there, Herodian masonry, and used it to rebuild some things down there. So the building, Solomon's Stables, is not from Herod's time. We don't have that remaining, but we have the blocks remaining, and these were used to rebuild something in essentially the same place, and it must have been essentially similar to what Herod would have built himself. You got to remember, whenever the temple was destroyed in AD 70, for, thousands of years, literally, after that, people continued to make use of all of the rubble which had fallen off the temple platform or the Temple Mount to build all types of other things. So picture something in your mind 35 acres large, and try to note that if you can remember this week sometime, and I think it will help prepare you for our study next week. Now, one more thing fits appropriately here before we conclude tonight, and that is Matthew chapter 4 and verse 5. Here's the one other thing that I think appropriately fits here. In the temptation of Christ, we have one of them, the so-called temptation on the pinnacle of the temple. Temptation on the pinnacle of the temple. Well, there are two proposed solutions as to what the pinnacle of the temple refers to. One says that what we have is Jesus being placed, along with Satan, on the temple building, the sanctuary itself. We'll see later it was a huge building, many feet high, topped with golden spikes on the top. We'll see and understand more about that later and why they were there. Well, the problem with that is that the word here is the general word. For temple, it's not the sanctuary term. It's hieron. The pinnacle of the temple complex. Not the temple building, the sanctuary itself. Moreover, back to our study in Wiest here recently, the Greek has the definite article, the. And that's important here. You should mark out your A. Set him on a pinnacle of the temple as though there were many of them. Set him on the pinnacle of the temple. Okay? Matthew 4 and verse 5. Setteth him on the pinnacle of the temple. That's important. The Greek has a definite article, not the indefinite. What does pinnacle mean? Well, it's not some technical word, as you might think when you first read it. It simply is a Greek word that means a high place. It simply means a high place. Now, long-standing Christian tradition, and note that I'm not saying I've got a proof text for it, long-standing Christian tradition has identified the pinnacle of the temple with the southeast corner of the Temple Mount wall. Okay, with the southeast corner right here of the Temple Mount wall. Keep in mind the fact Herod didn't have enough room to build the temple or to renovate it here. He's got to bring in a lot of fill, push back, fill in more of the southern Kidron Valley to give himself 35 acres. This is a very deep valley. That means you're going to have an exceedingly high wall here. You know, whenever fill is involved, if you've got a wall, let's say a retaining wall, you may be on one side of it, ground level, and the wall may stick up 2 feet above the ground. You get on the other side of it, you may see 20 feet of the wall. It's a retaining wall holding something up. That's exactly what this is. Think of it like a retaining wall. Down here, it just drops off. Up here, it's, kind of like ground level. To be sure, the walls are higher, not exactly like ground level, but it's like a retaining wall. This would be the corner that looks toward Gethsemane and that looks toward the Mount of Olives. Now, the reason that Christian tradition may well be correct in identifying the pinnacle of the temple with this southeastern corner of the Temple Mount wall can be seen from a very vivid description that Josephus gives us of the southeastern corner. Now, he's not writing to prove anything from a Christian point of view. He's just giving us Jewish history. I have a quote from Josephus. Listen to what he has to say. Not this corner. Here you've got Robinson's Arch that goes in, Wilson's Archway. Not this corner, this is Fortress of Antonia. Not this corner, there's nothing really up there. This is the deep valley down here. This would be the highest point if you're measuring it with the valley below. And here's what Josephus has to say. And it was a structure more noteworthy than any under the sun. For while the depth of the ravine, the Kidron Valley he means, was great, and no one who bent over to look into it from above could bear to look down to the bottom. The height of the portico, or the colonnade, remember I said that it's surrounded on all four sides by a colonnade, 100 feet plus high. The height of the colonnade standing over it was so very great that if anyone looked down from its rooftop, combining the two elevations, he would become dizzy and his vision would be unable to reach the end of so immense depth. Now, that's a direct quote from Josephus there. All right, let me explain what he just said. out of time, but I want to keep going and finish it. He says combining the two heights. What he's talking about is, first of all, you've got the actual wall itself here that drops off like 100 feet. Then, if you've got the porticos or the colonnades built around this that themselves are maybe 100 feet up in the air, you combine those two heights. Not only put Jesus on the corner of the temple wall, how about up on the very top of the colonnade that ran to the southeastern corner? Now, we're not told, was it that versus the wall? It just says a high place, the pinnacle of the temple. And Josephus says when you combine these two and you look over, you become dizzy, your vision would be unable to reach the end of so immense a depth. So I think that probably Christian tradition is reliable here, that the southeastern portion of the Temple Mount wall, perhaps including the colonnade, we're not told that, is the place in which this part of the temptation took place, from the pinnacle of the temple area. All right, let me just show you a picture of that. I've got it somewhere here. Here's a picture, but you've got to remember that we don't have, the Temple Mount as it was then. We've got some Herodian masonry. Those will be the big blocks you'll see at the bottom. Then all at the top is just later junk that the Crusaders and the Turks built there and that Christians have done since then, and no one knows exactly how high up it went. I'm going to show this and I'll pass it around, and you've got a man standing beside it as a yardstick. But the wall may well have been much higher than that back in those days. Then you've got to add on to it maybe that height again for the colonnade, if Jesus was on the top. Let me show it over here and I'll send it around. And I've got another one that I can send around as well. Those huge blocks you'll see at the bottom, those are Herodian stones. Those were definitely done by Herod's men. They bear all the marks and all the resemblances of Herodian work. I've got it in another one that's not quite as impressive, so you can maybe take the time to look at both of them before you're through tonight. This is a diagram that attempts to show what was Herodian masonry, and you can see it in the one below anyway, versus what has been added. You see, the Romans would have found it very, very difficult. How would you ever destroy a wall like that? You can send it around. You couldn't attack it from this side. The wall would fall down on top of you. You can only attack it from this side. But if so much of it's underground, how could you ever push it down then? They could get to the rest of the walls. Very, very little of the rest of the walls of the Temple Mount area itself from Herod's time are remaining today. The largest section that is remaining, with the exception of the western Wailing Wall, which is over here, is the southeastern corner.